Now to continue with where the last video left off, I'm going to be doing more dry brushing, and got my big fluffy brush. Now you may be asking yourself, you may not be, but you may be asking yourself, well, you've shown different dry brushes over the last few weeks in some of the vlogs. How do you choose which dry brush to use? I mainly go by size. On large open areas like this, I want a larger dry brush. If it were, I was trying to get into more detailed areas, I would go for a smaller dry brush. So it's not so much the brand or type or anything like that, but rather the size that I think about. Because since I've switched to these makeup brushes, and I also have those army painter ones that I've shown a couple of times, while I favor the makeup brushes over the army painter ones, it's really just looking for, like I said, looking for size. So that's my methodology. Get the biggin is pretty much what I'm looking for here. One thing about dry brushing is it's a very controllable technique if you take your time. You know, if you just go in and just start slabbing it on from every direction, it can get a little haphazard. But if you go at it a little slower, and specifically if you're thinking about, okay, where's the light going to fall from? In this case, it's going to come from the top up here. So by confining my dry brushing to that, generally, it's going to be a little more cohesive in its appearance. And you'll note that up here, I went a little heavier on these panels here. I'm okay with giving them a slightly lighter look just so they stand out a little more, because when I put some wash in there, it'll help make that pop. And you can do that. You can decide that you want, say, this panel here, you want it to have a lighter look up near the top of it. So you can dry brush heavier up there like that, bring it up from the bottom, that kind of thing. And you're doing some very subtle modulation. And if you have just a minimal amount of paint on your brush, it can look pretty good. It won't be as it looks like with an airbrush, but it can be reasonably close. So try that out if you haven't already done so. Now for the light gray parts, I'm going to use some Vallejo cold gray, which is essentially white. I mean, if you paint some cold gray on a model, it looks white. Then if you paint white over it, you see the difference. But for these purposes, I'm just going to go with the cold gray rather than white. And the reason for that, I mean, in a dry brushing environment, they'd probably look the same, but the reason for that, quite honestly, is the cold gray is within closer reach than the white. So the selection here was based purely on which one required the least stretching to grab. Now the joints have these kind of ribs around them, so I'm going to use some Citadel Stormhost silver, which is a brighter silver than the lead belcher that I originally put on there. I'm just going to bring those up a little bit so they look like they stand out from the surface a little bit. I'm going to be putting some shade on here later, so that'll help increase the contrast a little bit. Now on the gun and the magazine, I'm going to use that Stormhost silver to do some spongering. And this is not so much to represent chips, because I'm imagining this to just be bare metal, but just, if you've ever looked at a metallic surface that you used a lot, it'll have, I guess you'd call it scrapes. I know when I used to work many years ago, when I was in high school and worked at McDonald's, I always noticed that the stainless steel preparation tables that we used had just surface scrapes in them. It wasn't damage to the metal, but just places where there was discoloration from sliding other trays across it and, you know, handling things and moving things around and all of that. So it's not surface damage, it's just tonal variation. And right now it doesn't look very dramatic, but generally when you put some Nuln oil over it, it really kind of pops. Now for applying the Nuln oil to the joints, I decided that I'm just going to try and drop it in there between those areas that I brightened up. And I'm probably going to go with a couple of coats because I really want to make some distinction there. I could just slop this all over it. Normally I would do that. But as I begin to, literally as I turned the camera on to start filming this, I thought, hey, how about if I just drop it in there in the flat areas between the brighter parts. So sometimes decisions are made last minute. And the good thing is if I don't like the way it looks, well then I can just slop the Nuln oil over everything and won't be any worse for the wear. But I'm liking the way this is looking. Now over the gun parts, I'm just going to cover everything in Nuln oil because I want to really make those little scratchy marks pop out, as well as making the shape and the recesses and all of that come out. When you're using Nuln oil, I don't recommend doing it in sections because unless there's some kind of physical separation between the sections, because if you let it dry and then go on to the section next to it, I can't speak, then you're definitely going to see that tide mark where it dried up. So if you're covering something like this, I recommend going in fairly heavy with it and then getting everything coated and then just kind of moving it around to get rid of any excess. Like that excess right there, the way I get that up is I just run my brush across it like that and then just wipe some off on my thumb. And then I just keep coming back to it, getting more and more off. So it'll leave that a little brighter. But I'll avoid the tide marks that can come by doing it in sections. Unless you want the tide marks. I can see a case for that too. Now it's still drying just a little bit, but you can see how that joint just really, now there's some contrast between those lighter bands that I painted around it with the Stormhost Silver and the lead belcher, and the Nuln oil gave a little bit of definition around the bands there, so there's even more contrast and shadow, and it'll just be a really neat, subtle feature, I think, on the final model. Now here you can see the magazine, and it just shows that texture, I think, that I put in there. And as I move it around, you can see the light striking it in different ways. It just gives it an interesting look, I think. Here you can see that up close. And it just, I don't know, I just like the way that looks. It's very subtle, but I think it's a nice, it's one of those things that when somebody gets in close to look at it, I think it's kind of a reward for seeing extra detail, for paying attention to the work. All right, I've got everything dry brushed, so now it's just a matter of putting together the various sub-assemblies. And I will admit, this is one of my favorite parts of any build of these push-fit kits because it's so, I guess you'd say it's so Lego-like in that you've got everything colored and ready to go and you're just sort of snapping them together. Although I had to do a jump cut there because getting that little poly cap inside there, that was a little tough. I had to grit my teeth a little bit. But it really does remind me of, being a kid and building Lego and just all of that was so much fun. And, you know, you can glue the stuff together, but most of it fits really well. I think sometimes the hardest part is just getting all the parts oriented right. Because sometimes I look at the instructions and I take something that should be very easy and I make it so that it confuses me. And these days, I'm easily confused. But anyway, you know, if you've ever seen kits like this and you think, well, that's not real modeling, I would say don't knock it until you've tried it, because these really are just amazingly fun kits, and you can detail them and weather them and do all sorts of stuff with them. And the beauty is you get to do like this and paint it and start doing a lot of the detailing and all that before you ever assemble it. I mean, you can't do that with any other kind of model. And like, this is a great example of how quite often these kits are engineered so well. You see, you've got a seam here on the front and then one on the back. Well, they just provide parts that go over that, and it completely covers up the seam. That's really good planning and engineering. I mean, I know it's not possible to do that on every kit, but there are model companies that I wish would, traditional model companies that I wish would pay a little more attention to stuff like that. There's one of the legs, and I just love the fact that you can snap this thing together and there's not a bunch of seams showing, and you'd see that on older like Bandai HG kits, but newer kits, they're getting much better about hiding them. And this one, the fit, like I think I mentioned in maybe the first episode, the fit is not quite Bandai. I think I mentioned that, you know, if you have never built Bandai, you would think this was an excellent fitting kit. If you've built Bandai, you go, it's pretty good. But it's well engineered, it fits really well, and it's looking pretty cool. So let me get the rest of these parts, let me stop rambling and editorializing, let me get the rest of these parts snapped up, and we'll go from there. Here's something that kind of made me laugh. You got this bar that goes on the top right here, and you got these two T-shaped notches, holes, whatever, that it goes in. But when you look at the corresponding pegs here, one is inverted. So you can get one side to fit, but the other side won't fit. So I'm just going to trim off one side of it, the offending parts, so that they'll both slide in there. It kind of made me laugh because I did sit here for a couple of minutes going, wait a minute, am I missing something here? But then I finally concluded, no, this time it wasn't me. It was a gaffe in the engineering. So anyway, kind of funny. I don't know if it showed up real well earlier when I showed how I had done the spongering of the brighter silver color over the lead belcher and then put the Noan oil over it. But I think you can see here a better example of how it just to me, it just looks like worn steel. And I really like that effect. And it's just so simple. Lead belcher, sponge on some brighter silver, cover it all with Noan oil. All right, well, there's everything put together. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a gloss coat. I'm not going to assemble the model yet because it has very tight tolerances, and in doing that assembly, it's highly likely I would scratch some of the paint, and if I wait until after I gloss coat the model, then that's going to give it another protective layer, and it's going to be a little easier to get things snapped up. Or I may just wait. I may do the initial weathering with it still apart, just because that's a little easier. But this is how it looks. I like these colors. I wasn't sure about it going into it, but I like these colors. I like the way it looks. I did paint the little rockets here in his head. I gave them a dot of orange. I just thought that worked. I debated about that for quite a while, in my mind, and which is a scary place. There's monkeys and llamas running about all over. And I finally just decided to go with that orange because I just thought, okay, I just like the way that looks with everything else. But you can see parts are fairly simple. It's got different hand options that can be used, but I'll gloss coat it and then get to the decals, because for such a small model, it has a fairly large decal sheet. And I plan to use all of those. I'm going to go decal heavy on this one. Normally I don't put that many decals on models, but I'm just going to use all of these because I think it'll look cool. But gloss coat, then decals. And that should wrap up the video. Alright, I'm going to start adding the decals to the model. Off camera, I'm holding the decal in my hot water in my coffee cup on my coffee warmer, as I've described before. Sometimes I feel a little silly on some of these Patreon exclusive videos because I know a lot of you guys have watched all of them and you see me doing the same things over and over. So I apologize if it gets a little redundant. But I'm always surprised at how many times people say that they find the segments of me putting on decals helpful. And by the way, this is microset that I'm using as a surface prep. And I've never quite, I mean, I get that things, you know, as you're learning things, as you're figuring out how to do things, I get that, you know, some things are hard and then you do them for a while and they become easier. I get that concept. But I will admit, I don't quite understand the difficulty that I hear a lot of people expressing about decals in general. Now, maybe it's because I've been putting them on models since I was about 5 years old, 6 years old. I mean, the process really isn't that difficult, I think. But again, that it's easy to say that when I have a lot of experience putting on decals. I see things that other people do that appear very simple, and then I try to do it and I have great difficulty with it, such as, you know, layering paints and blending paints on figures and stuff like that. This is Solvaset, by the way, that I'm putting on. But like I said, I get a bit confused, wondering, to quote Seinfeld, what's the deal with that? You know, just I'm not real sure why it presents such a difficulty often. Now, the observations that I can make into, I guess you'd say, the phenomenon, however you say that word, are that I think quite often what I see is people just aren't familiar with the variety of tools that are available to use in the process. Quite often, and this is something that I've noticed in general with I hate to use the word less experienced modelers because I feel like I'm a fairly experienced modeler, and there's still times that I run into things like this and I have to reevaluate my thinking. But in general, we'll just say modelers. I think that's a better statement. Because I do it. I think a lot of people do it. We tend to think in a very linear fashion, or in a very limited fashion. Like, for example, with putting on decals, gloss coat, setting solution, put on decal, softening agent. That works. The reason we do that is because it works. But that's not the only way to get it done. That's not the only consideration. You know, you can put decals down on a surface that's not glossy successfully. Whoops, look at that. Just shows you have to be ready to deal with anything. But, you know, there's no one rote method. I mean, this is a perfect serendipity moment here you don't know what you're going to face when you're putting on a decal, and you don't know if it's going to be uncooperative like this one. And so having a variety of tools and methods and methodologies, I'm using big words today, I think really helps in getting the task done. More solve set. So, when you're looking at, like, I don't just say, okay, it's time for decals, therefore I must gloss coat. I gloss coated this one because I knew I had a lot of decals to put on. And see, that one's crooked. You know what? I don't worry about it. I gloss coated this one for two reasons, actually. Because I knew putting on a lot of decals, it needed a gloss coat. But two, I wanted to do a video about gloss coating with Future, which you'll see in a few weeks. But that's what I did between the last jump cut where I talked about putting on the decals, and now I've done a whole video about using Future to gloss coat your models, because I get a lot of questions about that. But you've seen me demonstrate, if you've watched several of my videos, you've seen me demonstrate that you don't have to have a gloss coat on the model to put on decals. There's ways of doing that successfully, not only with the microsol and the microset, but using Pledge as a setting solution. Hot water helps things. Cutting slices into the decal. Does the decal have a lot of carrier film? Like this there's a greater chance for silvering because there's clear spaces on there that bubbles can pop up under and things like that, which can cause silvering. But this yellow triangle that I'm going to put here, I'm not worried about that silvering because it's a solid color. So decals, it's never just one thing that you're doing. There's a whole lot of considerations. That's why I think it's important to always think several steps ahead as you're planning, and even before you start the build, to just kind of plan out the major steps of what you're going to be doing. I generally will have made the decision to gloss coat or not gloss coat, and other factors that go into applying decals long before it's actually time to put the decals on. Now I'll admit I tend to be a little obsessive. There's times when I probably overplan. And if you ask, is it possible to overplan? Yes, it is. Sometimes you just have to do the thing, whatever it is you're overplanning. But I do tend to try to think ahead, because all of these things are interrelated. And if you make a mistake in your planning, you can, go back and, okay, I should have done this then, and I needed to do that then, and so let me correct it by doing this or that or the other. But, if I think about what type of finish I want to apply to the model, what type of weathering I want to have, what kind of surface texture, what kind of look, then it lets me know, do I need to gloss coat? Do I need to worry about the decals? Do I need to worry about silvering? Do I even want to apply decals? And then it kind of informs the rest of the process that goes into getting the decals on, or whatever it is that you're thinking of doing. So I guess to wrap up this bit of philosophy, look for multiple ways to get things done. I use the analogy of tools in a toolbox. The more tools you have in your toolbox, the easier it is to get a task performed. And, looking at it and viewing the conditions and seeing what the conditions are and how it affects what it is you're trying to do will then inform which tools you need to pull from the toolbox to get something done. So don't look at putting on decals is okay. There's a single way to do it. But attack it, I guess you'd say, fearlessly. Try different things out. You know, I mean, in the long run, if you mess up a decal trying to figure out a better way to do this, in the long run, I think that's okay. Because, you know, like the old story of Thomas Edison, that he discovered 2,000 ways not to do the incandescent light bulb. You know, he had to figure out all those things that didn't work before he figured out what did work. Now, luckily, there's information, there's videos, there's documentation, whatever. But when it comes to putting these things on, there's a whole lot of different ways to do it. A whole lot of routes to get you there. So don't get locked into one method, I'd say. All right, while I've been rambling, I've been able to get a grand total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 decals on, and I still got this many to go. So I'm gonna call this a video. Hopefully you've seen what it is I do to apply decals, and you've probably gotten more than a belly full of John's philosophy on decal application. So I'll stop here. This is a Patreon exclusive video, so thank you for being a patron. And I'm just so very grateful. My family and I are so very grateful that you support me and the work that I do, because I've said it before, but I'll keep repeating it because it's the truth. I just would not be able to do this at the pace I do it, with the materials that I have, and you know, the kits that I can get, and all of these things, if it weren't for you. It would limit, you know, I'd still put out videos, I'd still build models, but it would limit my ability to explore other areas of it. And it would, you know, like I've said, this Patreon support is really important to us. It's not just a trivial thing. It's something that is really, really important to us. So thank you very much. And in the next video, I'll have the decals done, and it will be time to start getting this guy weathered, and we'll go through that. And it wouldn't be one of my videos if I didn't end it with this final thought. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.